Welcome! Today, we're diving into the basics of rent stabilization, a term you might have heard if you've ever rented an apartment in a big city. Rent stabilization is a set of laws and regulations designed to protect tenants from sudden, steep rent increases and to ensure a level of housing security. But what does it really mean for renters and landlords? In this video, we'll break down the key features, how it works, and why it matters. Whether you're a tenant, a landlord, or just curious about housing policies, understanding rent stabilization can help you navigate the rental market with confidence. Let's get started by exploring the core concept behind rent stabilization. Rent stabilization refers to a system of laws that limit how much landlords can increase rent each year for certain residential properties. The goal is to keep housing affordable and prevent tenants from being priced out of their homes due to rapid rent hikes. These laws typically apply to older buildings in cities with high demand for rental housing. Rent stabilization is different from rent control, which often sets a fixed maximum rent. Instead, rent stabilization allows for gradual, regulated increases, balancing tenant protection with landlord interests. Let's look at how these regulations are put into practice. Under rent stabilization, landlords are only allowed to increase rent by a certain percentage each year, as determined by local housing boards or government agencies. This percentage is usually tied to inflation or cost of living adjustments. For example, a city might set the annual rent increase cap at 2% to 4%. This means tenants can anticipate predictable rent changes, making it easier to budget and plan for the future. At the same time, landlords can still cover rising costs, but without imposing sudden, unaffordable hikes on tenants. Now, let's see which types of buildings are typically covered by these laws. Not every rental property falls under rent stabilization. Typically, these laws apply to older apartment buildings constructed before a certain year, often the 1972nd or earlier in cities with a history of housing shortages. Newer buildings, single-family homes, and small owner-occupied properties are usually exempt. The specific criteria vary by city and state, so it's important for both tenants and landlords to check local regulations. Understanding whether your building is covered can help you know your rights and responsibilities. Next, let's discuss the rights rent-stabilized tenants enjoy. Tenants living in rent-stabilized apartments have several important rights. First, their rent can only be increased by the regulated amount each year. Second, they often have the right to renew their leases, providing greater housing stability. In many cases, tenants also have protections against eviction, except for specific reasons like non-payment of rent or violating lease terms. These rights help tenants feel secure in their homes and prevent displacement due to unaffordable rent hikes. Let's move on to the responsibilities that come with these protections. While rent stabilization offers valuable protections, tenants also have responsibilities. They must pay rent on time, follow the terms of their lease, and maintain the property in good condition. Violating lease agreements or causing significant damage can still result in eviction, even in a rent-stabilized unit. It's a two-way street. Tenants are protected from unfair rent hikes, but they're also expected to be good neighbors and responsible renters. Next, let's look at what landlords are required to do under rent stabilization laws. Landlords of rent-stabilized properties have their own set of obligations. They must follow the rules for rent increases, provide proper notice for any changes, and offer lease renewals to tenants. Landlords are also required to maintain the property, ensuring it's safe and habitable. If repairs are needed, they must address them promptly. These rules are designed to create a fair balance between tenant protections and landlord rights. Now, let's explore how rent increases are determined each year. Each year, local housing boards or government agencies review economic conditions, such as inflation and operating costs, to determine the allowable rent increase for stabilized units. They hold public hearings and consider input from both tenants and landlords before setting the new rate. This process aims to ensure that rent increases are fair and reflect real-world changes in costs. Once the new rate is set, landlords must follow it exactly, no more, no less. Let's see how this process benefits both parties. For tenants, rent stabilization offers peace of mind. Knowing that rent increases are capped and predictable allows for better financial planning. It also reduces the risk of being forced out due to sudden, unaffordable rent hikes. This stability is especially important in cities where housing costs are high and vacancies are low. Rent stabilization helps keep long-term residents in their communities, supporting neighborhood continuity and diversity. Next, let's examine the benefits for landlords. Landlords also gain from rent stabilization. While they can't raise rents as much as they might like, they benefit from lower tenant turnover and more consistent rental income. Stable, long-term tenants are less likely to leave, reducing the costs and risks associated with finding new renters. Additionally, clear rules about rent increases and lease renewals can simplify property management. Let's now look at some common misconceptions about rent stabilization. There are several myths about rent stabilization. Some people think it means tenants never face rent increases, but that's not true. Rents can go up just in a controlled way. Others believe landlords can't make a profit, but the system is designed to allow reasonable returns. It's also a myth that rent stabilization applies to all rentals. In reality, only certain buildings qualify. Clearing up these misconceptions helps everyone better understand how the system works. Next, let's compare rent stabilization to rent control. Rent stabilization and rent control are often confused, but they're not the same. Rent control usually means rents are frozen at a certain level, often for decades, and only rise in rare circumstances. Rent stabilization, on the other hand, allows for regular, regulated increases. This makes it more flexible and adaptable to changing economic conditions. Both systems aim to protect tenants, but rent stabilization is more common in modern housing policy. Let's see where rent stabilization is most widely used. Rent stabilization is most common in large cities with high housing demand and limited supply. New York City is perhaps the best-known example, but similar systems exist in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco. Each city has its own rules and eligibility criteria, reflecting local housing markets and political priorities. If you're renting in a major city, it's worth checking whether your apartment is covered by rent stabilization law. Now, let's look at how these laws have evolved over time. Rent stabilization laws emerged in the mid-20th century as a response to housing shortages and rising rents in urban areas. Over the decades, these laws have been updated to reflect changing economic conditions and housing needs. Some cities have expanded protections, while others have scaled them back. The evolution of rent stabilization reflects ongoing debates about affordability, fairness, and the role of government in the housing market. Next, let's discuss how rent stabilization impacts the broader community. Rent stabilization doesn't just affect tenants and landlords, it shapes entire communities. By keeping rents affordable, it helps maintain economic and social diversity in neighborhoods. Long-term residents can stay in their homes, supporting local businesses and schools. However, critics argue that it can discourage new construction or lead to reduced maintenance if landlords feel squeezed. Balancing these effects is a key challenge for policymakers. Let's now look at how rent stabilization is enforced. Enforcing rent stabilization requires oversight by local housing agencies. These agencies handle complaints, investigate violations, and ensure landlords comply with the rules. Tenants can report illegal rent increases or improper evictions, and agencies have the authority to impose penalties or order rent refunds. Effective enforcement is crucial for the system to work as intended. Next, let's see what happens if a landlord violates rent stabilization laws. If a landlord violates rent stabilization laws by raising rent too much, refusing to renew a lease, or failing to maintain the property, they can face serious consequences. Local agencies may order them to roll back rents, pay fines, or even compensate tenants. In extreme cases, landlords can lose their right to manage the property. These penalties are designed to protect tenants and ensure fair play in the rental market. Let's now talk about how tenants can check if their unit is rent stabilized. Tenants can usually check if their apartment is rent stabilized by contacting their local housing agency or searching online databases. Some cities require landlords to provide written notice if a unit is covered. Knowing your status is important for understanding your rights and protections. If you're unsure, don't hesitate to reach out to local authorities for clarification. Next, let's look at the process for renewing a lease in a rent-stabilized unit. In rent-stabilized apartments, tenants usually have the right to renew their lease when it expires. Landlords must offer a renewal on the same terms, with only the regulated rent increase applied. The renewal period and notice requirements vary by city, but the process is designed to ensure tenants aren't forced out unfairly. This stability is a cornerstone of rent stabilization. Let's now discuss what happens when a tenant moves out of a stabilized unit. When a tenant leaves a rent-stabilized apartment, the unit usually remains covered by stabilization laws. The landlord can only raise the rent by the allowed amount, even for new tenants. In some cases, if the rent reaches a certain threshold or the building is converted, the unit may become deregulated. These rules help prevent landlords from evading stabilization by frequently turning over tenants. Next, let's look at how rent stabilization affects apartment upgrades and repairs. Landlords can make improvements to rent-stabilized apartments, such as renovating kitchens or upgrading appliances. In some cities, they're allowed to pass a portion of these costs on to tenants through temporary rent increases, but only with approval from housing authorities. This system encourages property maintenance while protecting tenants from excessive charges. Let's now explore how rent stabilization interacts with other tenant protections. Rent stabilization often works alongside other tenant protections, such as anti-discrimination laws, security deposit limits, and requirements for safe living conditions. These overlapping rules create a comprehensive safety net for renters. If you're a tenant, It's important to know all the protections available to you, not just those related to rent. Next, let's discuss how rent stabilization policies are updated and changed. Rent stabilization laws aren't set in stone, they're regularly reviewed and updated by local governments. Changes can be prompted by shifts in the housing market, economic conditions, or political priorities. Public input is often sought during these reviews, giving tenants and landlords a voice in the process. Staying informed about policy changes is important for everyone involved. Now, let's look at the arguments for and against rent stabilization. Supporters of rent stabilization argue that it's essential for keeping cities affordable and preventing displacement. They say it helps low and middle-income families stay in their homes, supports community stability, and reduces homelessness. By capping rent increases, it gives tenants peace of mind and financial security. These benefits are especially important in cities with high housing costs. Next, let's hear the arguments against rent stabilization. Critics argue that rent stabilization can discourage new construction and investment in rental housing. They claim it may lead to reduced maintenance if landlords feel they can't cover costs, and that it can create a two-tiered market where some tenants benefit more than others. Some also say it doesn't address the root causes of housing shortages. These debates are ongoing in many cities. Let's now look at how rent stabilization fits into broader housing policy. Rent stabilization is just one tool in the broader effort to make housing more affordable. It often works alongside policies like affordable housing development, housing vouchers, and tax incentives for landlords. Policymakers must balance the needs of tenants, landlords, and the community as a whole. Understanding how rent stabilization fits into this bigger picture helps clarify its role and limitations. Next, let's look at some real-life examples of rent stabilization in action. New York City has one of the largest rent stabilization programs in the country. About 1 million apartments are covered, providing stability for millions of residents. The city's Rent Guidelines Board sets annual rent increase limits, and tenants have strong protections against eviction. This system has helped keep housing affordable for generations, though it's not without controversy. Let's look at another example from the West Coast. Los Angeles also has a robust rent stabilization ordinance covering hundreds of thousands of rental units built before 1978. The city's rules limit annual rent increases and require landlords to provide relocation assistance in some cases. Los Angeles uses rent stabilization as part of a broader strategy to address housing affordability and homelessness. Now, let's see how San Francisco approaches rent stabilization. San Francisco's rent stabilization laws apply to most multi-unit buildings constructed before 1979. The city's rent board sets annual increase limits and enforces tenant protections. San Francisco's approach is notable for its strong tenant advocacy and active enforcement. However, the city also faces challenges with high housing demand and limited supply. Let's now look at how rent stabilization affects different types of renters. Rent stabilization can benefit a wide range of renters, from families to seniors to young professionals. For low-income tenants, it can be a lifeline that keeps them housed. For others, it offers predictability and peace of mind. However, some renters may not qualify if their building isn't covered. Understanding who benefits most can help inform future policy decisions. Next, let's discuss how landlords can apply for exemptions or increases beyond the standard limits. In some cases, landlords can apply for exemptions from rent stabilization or request higher rent increases due to financial hardship. They must provide documentation showing that standard increases aren't enough to cover operating costs or necessary repairs. Local housing boards review these requests and decide whether to grant them. This process ensures that landlords can maintain their properties while still protecting tenants. Let's now look at how rent stabilization interacts with eviction laws. Rent-stabilized tenants usually have strong protections against eviction. Landlords can only evict for specific reasons, such as non-payment of rent, illegal activity, or owner move-in. Even then, they must follow strict legal procedures and provide proper notice. These protections help prevent unfair or retaliatory evictions. Next, let's discuss how rent stabilization affects the resale value of properties. Rent stabilization can affect the resale value of rental properties. Some investors may view stabilized units as less attractive due to limited rent increases, while others appreciate the steady income and lower turnover. The impact varies depending on the local market and the specific property. Understanding these effects is important for both buyers and sellers. Let's now look at how rent stabilization is communicated to tenants. Landlords are often required to notify tenants in writing if their unit is rent stabilized. This notice must include information about rent increase limits, lease renewal rights, and how to contact local housing agencies. Clear communication helps tenants understand their rights and avoid disputes. Let's now discuss how rent stabilization interacts with affordable housing programs. Rent stabilization and affordable housing programs often work together to address housing needs. Affordable housing programs may offer lower rents based on income, while rent stabilization ensures predictable increases. Some units may be covered by both types of programs, providing extra security for tenants. Understanding how these systems overlap can help renters access the support they need. Next, let's look at how rent stabilization is funded and administered. Rent stabilization programs are typically funded and administered by local governments. Housing agencies oversee enforcement, handle complaints, and provide information to tenants and landlords. Funding comes from city budgets, sometimes supplemented by fees paid by landlords. Effective administration is key to ensuring the system works smoothly. Let's now discuss the role of tenant advocacy groups. Tenant advocacy groups play a vital role in supporting renters. They provide education about rent stabilization, help tenants navigate disputes, and lobby for stronger protections. These organizations often work closely with local governments to ensure policies reflect tenant needs. If you're a renter, connecting with an advocacy group can be a valuable resource. Next, let's look at the future of rent stabilization. The future of rent stabilization is uncertain and will depend on economic trends, housing demand, and political decisions. Some cities are expanding protections, while others are considering reforms or rollbacks. Ongoing debates about affordability and fairness will shape the evolution of these laws. Staying informed and engaged is important for anyone affected by rent stabilization. Let's now summarize the key points we've covered. To recap, rent stabilization is a set of laws that limit rent increases and protect tenants from sudden displacement. It applies to certain buildings, offers rights and responsibilities for both tenants and landlords, and is enforced by local agencies. While it has both supporters and critics, rent stabilization remains a key part of housing policy in many cities. Understanding how it works can help you make informed decisions as a renter or landlord. Next, let's answer some frequently asked questions. Yes, your rent can go up in a rent-stabilized apartment, but only by the amount set by local authorities each year. Landlords must provide notice and follow the rules for increases. If you receive a notice for a higher increase, contact your local housing agency for help. Let's move on to another common question about lease renewals. No, tenants are not required to renew their lease if they choose to move out. However, landlords must offer a renewal to tenants in rent-stabilized units following the regulated increase. This gives tenants the choice to stay or leave with the security of knowing their rights are protected. Next, let's address a question about eviction. Tenants in rent-stabilized apartments can only be evicted for specific legal reasons, such as non-payment of rent or violating the lease. Landlords must follow strict procedures and provide proper notice. If you believe you're being evicted unfairly, contact your local housing agency or a tenant advocacy group for assistance. Let's answer a question about repairs and maintenance. Landlords are responsible for maintaining rent-stabilized apartments and making necessary repairs. Tenants should report issues promptly and in writing. If repairs aren't made, tenants can file a complaint with the local housing agency. Proper maintenance is a key part of the rent stabilization agreement. Next, let's answer a question about rent increases after improvements. If a landlord makes major improvements to a rent-stabilized apartment, they may be allowed to raise the rent temporarily, but only with approval from housing authorities. Tenants should receive notice and have the opportunity to challenge unreasonable increases. This ensures that upgrades benefit both parties without causing hardship. Finally, let's wrap up with some closing thoughts. Rent stabilization is a complex but important part of the rental housing landscape. It offers protections for tenants, stability for landlords, and helps maintain vibrant, diverse communities. While it's not a perfect system, understanding how it works can empower you to make better decisions, whether you're renting, owning, or just interested in housing policy. Thanks for joining us on this journey through rent stabilization. Stay informed, know your rights, and take an active role in your housing future.